Welcome. Today we're going to take a look at audience and purpose. We're going to look at these two tools. These are tools that writers use to hone in their writing and to improve their writing. So let's take a look at these and see how we can use them for our own stories. So let's start off with audience. So audience includes the person or the people that the writer is writing for. And as we're reading stories, poetry, novels, and so forth, we can make some pretty good guesses as to who those writers intended to write for. As we're writing our own stories, we can also identify, and I think it will help you to identify, who your intended audience is. I think it can help you as a writer be more specific and more in tune with your pieces that you're working on. If you can identify who you're writing for, and if you can get that much more specific rather than a broad group, I think it can make that process even better for you. So for example, if you ever read a book by Stephen King that he's got called On Writing, this is about his experience of his own writing process, and he talks about how he writes everything that he does for his wife, Tabitha. So he is writing for one person. Now it just happens to be that there are many millions of people who also like his writing. They also like what Tabitha writes. But when he sits down to write a story, to write a novel, he's just writing for her. He just has her in mind. So if you can use something like that along those lines, I think that that can help you with your own writing. So you've got that intended audience, that group that, or the individual person that you're writing for up front. But then, of course, you also have the unintended audience. So the unintended audience, for Stephen King, for example, that would be everybody else who also happens to enjoy the same type of stories that Tabitha likes. So your stories will be the same, I'm sure, where you may write for one person or you may write for one group of people, but you may find that more people are actually pretty interested in your stories than you thought up front. You can also have a changing audience. So you may start writing at the beginning and you may think, you know what, I'm really just writing this for my sister because I think my sister is really going to like these stories. But as you start working on them, your audience may change and you may say, you know what, I think that these stories are for more than just my sister. I think these stories would be enjoyed by many people. And you may expand and change that audience up front. That's normal to do and that's okay to do. Absolutely. Now, when we're thinking about audience, we can get really specific and think about one individual person, your mom, your daughter, your aunt, a neighbor, and so forth. And certainly that can make things a lot easier for you as a writer because you're being very specific as to who you're identifying your intended audience to be. And that can help you hone in on exactly how you're phrasing your words, how you're putting together your sentences and paragraphs, how much detail that you're including, and so forth. Another thing that you can do is you could write toward a group of people. So if you intend to write toward, say, English professors or horror novel readers or so forth, that's another thing that you can do. Because sometimes those people are going to share certain traits and certain interests that may fit really well with what it is that you're writing. One of the things you want to try is to find a balance between what's too personal and what's just right. Because sometimes that can be quite a challenge is to determine exactly where that kind of sweet spot is. And you may need to just play with your writing and work with your audience a little bit until you can identify exactly how that's going to work well for you. Now, when you're writing for memoir or for a creative nonfiction, this can actually be a little bit different than when you're doing poetry or when you're doing straight fiction. And the reason is because you're sharing your personal stories or you're sharing the stories from your family, and you may be writing those for one individual person, but you may have the intention or the reality may be that your stories end up being passed down. They could be passed down for generations. So you may want to take into consideration how might your stories impact descendants over time, or how might your stories also inform historians. We have found that letters that people write, diary entries, Stories that they've shared about their experiences have been shared outside of family groups, and sometimes they're shared with museums or historians and so forth. So just something to keep in the back of your mind, that your audience may change without your permission, so to speak. You know, you may write something for one person or for one group of people, and that audience may end up changing over time. So it's just something to think about as you're creating your work, particularly with nonfiction. Now, the other piece of this puzzle here is purpose. Audience and purpose really work well together, and you want to take these two things into consideration when you're writing. Now, as a writer, you may think about these before you start writing, or you may think about these as you're within the process. With purpose, you're identifying the reason that you're writing that piece. And traditionally, we may say that writers are writing to inform, to persuade, to entertain, or to express something artistically. But as you're sitting down to write, if you can identify those very broad purposes there, and then it's better for you, I think, if you can kind of hone in and become more specific about your purpose for writing. You also want to think about what effect do you want to have on your audience? How much do you want to inform or persuade and so forth? And you may also have a primary purpose, which may be that purpose that you have up front, where you're really thinking about, okay, this is really what I want to get across. But then over time, you may find that your purpose changes, just as your audience can change, and that's okay. That's very normal for that to happen too. Now, with purpose, you may think about a couple of different options here. Oftentimes with fiction writing, we're writing for the purposes of entertaining or informing. For entertaining, you may think about, scary stories to read while camping, or humorous poetry for kids. Certainly, these are the types of stories that have been done and have worked out really well. And to inform, you may look at like a guidebook on raising confident teens. That's going to be much more nonfiction, of course, as well as the history of women in colonial New England. Again, much more nonfiction. A writer can inform through fiction, though. And sometimes you'll see readers, who come to fiction writing because they want to seek the truth through fiction. And sometimes that does occur. Now, again, just as with your audience, your purpose may change as you write. Or projects sometimes kind of take on lives of their own, and many writers will attest that they started one book and ended up with something different. That absolutely happens. Sometimes you may start thinking, what, I'm writing for 8 to 10-year-olds, and I want to write a book about gardening. And then by the end of the book, you may find, what, I'm not writing for that group at all. I'm actually writing for grandparents. And it's still a book about gardening, but my audience has changed, and therefore my purpose had to be adjusted a little bit. Very normal for that to occur, absolutely. So some tips to take into consideration as a writer. Write for one person. That helps you to hone in on how to write, what to write, how to organize things for yourself. That can help you to put pen to paper. One way to do that is to write a letter to your intended audience explaining the piece to them. That can help you become more specific about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And same thing with your purpose. Write down your purpose. What is it that you want to do? What is it you want to accomplish? What are you trying to achieve? And you can start that off by simply saying, in this story, I want to, and then go through and finish that off. So as you start into your writing, take a minute to just consider audience and purpose, and just think, how am I going to use these two things in my writing? I think if you can identify your audience and your purpose up front, even if those end up changing throughout your process, that's okay. But I think that this will help you to be a better writer and to feel more confident in your writing.